Alright guys, how's it going? Last week the technology world endured one of the most bizarre episodes in living memory as Israeli security startup CTS Labs advised of their discovery of critical security vulnerabilities on major AMD product lines affecting millions of devices, organizations and users. In total, 13 critical security vulnerabilities discovered throughout AMD Ryzen and EPYC product lines. I watched this whole sordid affair unravel over the minutes, hours and days after launch, while picking up one or two little curiosities on the way. I will of course be analysing them towards the end of this video, but to start with I'm going to recap what transpired over at amdflaws.com. The first I knew about it was when a viewer emailed me the link and their severe security advisory on AMD processors. As we can see here, they have a white paper and also links to a video. And in fact, the company CTS Labs had launched not one but two videos. The first one here is Amd Flaws Overview, which gives us a quick rundown of the vulnerabilities. And the second one was an interview with their CEO and other members of the company. And looking at some of the language used, especially in this interview, these vulnerabilities looked extremely bad indeed. However, I could not shake off the feeling that this was an absolute scam, and much of that had to do with the language being used, and also this name amdflaws.com, which I found to be somewhat bizarre coming from a supposedly professional outfit. So going over to the white paper, and we learn of the 4 critical security vulnerabilities, 3 of which take place inside AMD's Secure Processor, the PSP, and one within the Ryzen chipset. And for the sake of completion, I'll give a quick overview of each. Here we can see Ryzen Fall, Master Key, Fallout, and Chimera. We've got used to these catchy names over the past few months, stuff like Spectre and Meltdown, and these names are certainly chosen for maximum impact. But starting with EPYC's vulnerabilities, those would be Master Key and Fallout, both affecting AMD's Secure Processor. And here we have a die shot showing AMD's Secure Processor. It is a tiny piece of silicon within the CPU, a 32-bit ARM Cortex-A5. And over at ARM we can see the Cortex-A5 is just 0.2mm squared in size, and that was at 28nm. On 14nm like Ryzen and EPYC, that'll be less than half this size. It is also very power efficient. So that's effectively what the PSP is. AMD Secure Processor is a tiny ARM core within the Zen core and other AMD CPUs. But starting with Master Key, and something of a red flag because Master Key requires local administrator access in order to flash the BIOS. Now that may sound really far-fetched to you, but this can actually be done on a compromised system. For example, if the user stupidly downloads an executable file without knowing exactly what it is, and that executable could theoretically flash the BIOS, at which point AMD's PSP could either be overwritten with malware, or perhaps just have the protections bypassed on startup. Fallout is quite similar to Master Key, also requiring local administrator access. The main concern with Master Key and Fallout is that an attacker could pull all of this off without your knowledge. They could theoretically flash the BIOS, restart the PC, and have some kind of malware hanging around there, almost completely undetectable for an indefinite amount of time. At least that is the theory, and as you'll see later, CTS Labs have shown something similar in action. But now moving on to Ryzen Pro, which is effectively the business version of Ryzen Consumer. As we can see here, Chimera affects the AMD Promontory chipset, with Ryzen Fall affecting the PSP. As with Fallout and Master Key, both of these vulnerabilities require local administrator access. And Chimera is quite an interesting one, as AMD's Promontory chipset is based on IP from a company called ASMedia. And ASMedia is a company whose chips are used not only in AMD chipsets, but also in Intel chipsets. We'll see how that's valid later. Regarding Ryzen Mobile, Ryzen Fall affects the PSP. There is no Promontory chipset in Ryzen Mobile, therefore there is no vulnerability to Chimera. And lastly, we have Ryzen Workstations, which are vulnerable to Chimera, Master Key, and Ryzen Fall. In each case, every one of these vulnerabilities requires local administrator access, and in some cases these vulnerabilities really only work when combined with another. But that'll do for the overview of the vulnerabilities. I'm not going to go too deeply into it, as security really isn't my thing. Now, security may not be my thing, but as you're well aware of by now, conspiracy theories and tinfoil hattery certainly is. But the fact here is, regarding this security advisory and these critical security vulnerabilities, it did not require conspiracy theory to see that something was seriously amiss here. I already talked about the wording in the video, but even from the beginning of the white paper, we can see here that in CTS Labs' opinion, the basic nature of some of these vulnerabilities amounts to complete disregard of fundamental security principles, raising concerning questions regarding security practices, auditing and quality controls at AMD. And while reading this, I had to ask myself, what is to be gained by such a paragraph? White papers are supposed to be technical papers, not opinion pieces, and just over the page we read about lives potentially being put at risk. With this image of AMD, we're on your plane. I would wager that the vast majority of people have never seen this image. I do remember it from years ago, but this is a very obscure image that CTS Labs have somehow managed to dig up. On page 7 and their background of AMD Secure Processor, we learn that the AMD Secure Processor has been a centre of controversy within the open source and security communities, with critics being concerned that it is a black box. Later on in the white paper, when discussing mitigations for each of the 4 classes of vulnerability, we learn that in the cases of rise and fall, there are no known mitigations, for fallout there are no known mitigations, and for Chimera there are no mitigations available, with the solution involving either a workaround or a recall. And finally, in their conclusion, CTS Labs says that it is their view that the existence of these vulnerabilities betrays disregard of fundamental security principles. This is pretty harsh language in complete opposition to what we saw with Spectre and Meltdown. But as you'll now see, that was not where the differences ended in how the situation with Spectre and Meltdown was handled, because only a few hours later, Viceroy Research, financial analysts and a group of individuals that see the world differently, on the same day launched their own report, AMD The Obituary, with them analysing CTS Labs' report exposing fatal security vulnerabilities across AMD products. Starting with EPYC and Ryzen processors containing severe and pervasive security flaws that put users and organisations at an unacceptable and damaging risk, while being practically impossible to patch. And interestingly, they believe that AMD was compelled to release products as quickly and cheaply as possible as it was falling behind its competitors, leading to a complete oversight or negligence of security fundamentals. They believe that these issues identified by CTS are fatal to AMD on a commercial level and outright dangerous at an international level. And they believe that AMD is now worth $0 and will have no choice but to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Now, like I said, this is only a few hours after we heard of AMD flaws, yet Viceroy already had time to put together a 25-page hit piece on AMD, which I'm sure you'll agree is kind of curious. Even more curious, on the same date, the 13th of March, the story was told almost simultaneously across a slew of different publications. But you might think, well, there's nothing too unusual about that. The same thing happened with Spectre and Meltdown. There was, however, one major difference here. Over at AnandTech, we learned what that was because the security researchers CTS Labs, who published these Ryzen flaws, only gave AMD 24 hours prior notice before going live. I'm sure you remember that Intel and AMD were both given 6 months notice regarding Spectre and Meltdown. Yet in this case, CTS Labs only gave AMD 24 hours prior notice, and given the time it takes to put white papers together, and even website articles, it's all rather apparent that the press was contacted before AMD ever were. Over at Twitter, however, security experts were not pulling their punches, with some calling the AMD Flaws white paper as overhyped beyond belief, with others noting that the BIOS has to be flashed, and even then if the BIOS is right locked it will fail, and then later on that there are plenty of ways this can be mitigated by an OEM. And it wasn't long before CTS Labs themselves were under scrutiny, with Reddit users doing detective work and digging up some rather interesting facts. For example, the Who Is record for AMDflaws.com discovered the domain was created on the 22nd of February, and over at CTS Labs YouTube, where the channel was created on the 10th of March, only 3 days before they went live with their security advisory. And the queries just kept coming, this time with Viceroy Research being under scrutiny over market abuse and a previous financial scandal. And in this instance we see the Cape Town Treasury slamming Viceroy as being reckless over their Capitec report only last month. Over at Anantech, we learned that CTS Labs was Catenoid Security, which was formerly FlexiGrid Systems Incorporated and the company that produced the computer hijacking crowd cores. Later on, we discovered that CTS Labs, in their video, had created their offices out of thin air. There's nothing particularly unusual about this, but they used green screens and stock footage to create the video. Perhaps the most unusual thing about this is, this requires a level of expertise and money, which would perhaps only be expected of a company with plenty to spend. So where could this money be coming from? Well, back over at amdflaws.com, if you click on the full disclaimer, we now see a full legal disclaimer, the exact same of which can be seen at the very end of the white paper. I'll start by going over this paragraph, as I haven't actually mentioned this until this point. But up until now, in this white paper, there was nothing to prove that these vulnerabilities actually existed. And CTS Labs are claiming that it simply summarises security vulnerabilities, but purposefully does not provide a complete description, so that somebody with a malicious intent does not actually go out and use those exploits, which is kind of fair enough. However, had they actually just held back 6 months, they would then have been able to release a complete description in a proper white paper. But that is the reason why they claimed the white paper was short on details. But most tellingly, by far and away the most telling sentence in this disclaimer is this one. Although we have a good faith belief in our analysis and believe it to be objective and unbiased, you are advised that we may have, either directly or indirectly, an economic interest in the performance of the securities of the companies whose products are the subject of our reports. Now that can mean various things, and I will touch on this again towards the end of this video, but by this point, people are pretty much assuming that CTS Labs and Viceroy Research have collaborated in an attempt to short AMD stock, perhaps even kill off AMD with this massive scare story with no real research behind it, and simply cash in on the fallout of AMD stock. That was the direction that this had now taken, with the majority of the press also following that course. Now, you may be surprised to learn that everything you've heard so far happened during the same day, March the 13th. And at the end of March the 13th, we finally got some evidence of the truth of CTS Labs' claims when Dan Guido, the CEO of security firm Trail of Bits, announced in a tweet that CTS Labs had asked him to review the research last week and sent a full technical report with proof of concept exploit code for each set of bugs, before continuing, regardless of the hype around the release, the bugs are real, accurately described in their technical report, which as we just discussed was not public, and CTS Labs' exploit code actually works. And there's no reason whatsoever to not believe what Dan Guido is saying. Although, as is the way of things, his own involvement here soon came under scrutiny, including the fact that they were paid $14,000 by CTS Labs in order to validate the claims. However, Dan responded to that with this. First of all, this was driven by curiosity. However, once they received the full technical report, and after CTS Labs had fielded their first set of questions, they realised it went beyond that, so they asked to get paid. They had only anticipated one bug, not 13. So basically, Trail of Bits have validated all of these bugs using CTS Labs' proof of concept code, and this was the first confirmation that there was something up here. It wasn't just a complete scam designed to lower the stock price. But the heat towards CTS Labs continued, and it basically came around the way they disclosed this information, and this led to the CTO releasing an updated statement. The first part being the history of the publication, and this is where things start getting really interesting. As discussed before, the Promontory chipset was built on ASMedia's chips, and CTS Labs claimed that this was their original research topic, and they found manufacturer backdoors inside the chips which give you full control over the chips. And they even name the chips here. ASM obviously stands for ASMedia, 1042, 1142 and 1143. And at that point they said they wanted to go public with the findings, but then they saw that AMD had outsourced their chipset to ASMedia, so they decided to check the state of AMD, bought a Ryzen PC, and were very surprised to find out that their exploit code actually worked out of the box. At which point they said, what on earth is going on at AMD, and started researching AMD instead. From that point they discovered a slew of these vulnerabilities that we've already talked about. This final paragraph here though was quite telling, and once again it's one I will touch upon at the very end of this video. But after they discovered all this, that was when they decided to go public. And the reason was that CTS Labs honestly think it's hard to believe that they were the only group in the world who has noticed these vulnerabilities, considering who the actors are in the world today, and them only being a small group of 6 researchers. So basically what they're saying is, these flaws are so simple that there must be others out there who know about this and are possibly exploiting it. But staying with these ASMedia chips right now, and over at Extreme Tech on the 15th of March, CTS Labs responds to allegations of bad faith over AMD security disclosures and digs itself a deeper hole. And it's Joel Hruska again who writes some great articles over at Extreme Tech, and he also noted the ASMedia chips 1042, 1142 and 1143. And he goes on to say that it is absolutely fair to characterise and test the flaws in AMD's chipsets, but as CTS Labs white paper makes clear, the same ASMedia chips that make up AMD's proprietary chipset for Ryzen CPUs have been shipping on motherboards, including hundreds of Intel motherboard models for at least the past 6 years. And as Joel notes, by its own statements, CTS Labs tested and developed a proof-of-concept exploit for ASMedia controllers before it was aware these controllers were incorporated into Ryzen chipsets. So where then is the website asmediaflaws.com? Where's the notification to tell Intel motherboard customers that the chips on their motherboards can be similarly backdoored and abused? And Joel notes that this isn't a theoretical, because he was writing this article from an Ivy Bridge E system containing an ASMedia 1042 controller. So these ASMedia controllers, responsible for the Chimera backdoor inside Ryzen chipset, with what they claim no mitigations available, are certainly not an AMD issue, and in fact almost certainly affect far more Intel machines than AMD machines currently. Yet as we see in this image in the white paper, there is only mention of these controllers found on Ryzen, Ryzen Pro and on certain AMD laptops, and also found on certain high-end Ryzen motherboards. And reading through the comments, Joel dealing with one of the trolls who claimed that we're talking about ancient ASMedia controllers going back to 2011, to which Joel responded with a link to Tech Power Up showing an ASMedia ASM 1142 controller in the current ECS Z370 lightsaber. So that was Chimera being an AMD issue well and truly dead. And later on at night on the 15th, over at AnandTech again and their interesting call with CTS Labs. AnandTech's Ian Cutress and David Cantor from Real World Tech had a chat with both the CEO and CFO of CTS Labs, and this was probably the most revealing article on the whole affair. As you can see, it is pretty long. There will of course be a link in the description below. But what I'm going to do here is just pick out the most revealing parts of the discussion, starting with Ian Cutress, who asked, who are CTS Labs? How did the company start and what is the backgrounds of the employees? The response being, this is our first major publication. Mostly we do not go public with our results. We just deliver our results to our customers. This is our first major publication. Mostly we do not go public with our results. We just deliver our results to our customers. I should say very importantly that we never deliver the vulnerabilities themselves that we find or the flaws to a customer to whom the product does not belong. In other words, if you go to CTS Labs with a request for an audit of your own, then they will give you the code and the proof of concepts. But if you want them to audit somebody else's product, even as a consumer of a product or a competitor's product or a financial institution, we will not give you the actual code. They will only describe to you the flaw that they find. Continuing with, this is our business model. This time around, they started with ASMedia, and as you probably know, the story moved to AMD as they imported the ASMedia technology into their chipset. Having studied one, they started studying the other, and it became a very large and important project, so we decided we were going to go public with the report. That is what has brought us here. But further down they then say, actually, ASMedia was a test project, as they're engaged in many projects, and they were looking into their equipment, and that's how it started. But think about what they've just said there. Their business model basically revolves around companies going to CTS Labs requesting an audit for either their own products or a competitor's product. The question here, of course, is, who paid for this? It is crystal clear that AMD did not pay for this, so somebody else must have. They have just said that it became a very large and important project for them, so who paid for it? The next question of note, again from Ian Cutress, was this. As some of these attacks go through TrustZone, an ARM Cortex A5 and the ASMedia chipsets, can you speak about other products with these features can also be affected? To which CTS Labs responded, regarding the chipset, there you actually have vulnerabilities that affect a range of products. And as they explained earlier, they just looked first at AMD by looking at ASMedia chips. And as you know, they're talking about the ASMedia 1042, 1142 and the recently released 1143. But now they finally admit that yes, their exploits work on AMD Ryzen machines, but it also works on any machine that has these ASMedia chipsets, and so quite a few motherboards and other PCs are affected by these vulnerabilities as well. Next up, once again, Ian Curtis, and would it be fair to say that you felt that AMD would not be able to mitigate these issues within a reasonable time frame, therefore you went ahead and made them public? With CTS Labs' response being, I think that is a very fair statement. I would add that we saw that it was big enough of an issue that the consumer had the right to know about them. And this was an angle they played continuously, saying that this issue was big enough and it was all about the consumer's right to know about these flaws. Which is quite altruistic behaviour from a company, I'm sure you'll agree, if that was indeed their intent. Next up was David Cantor, who asked, how are you absolutely sure that these issues cannot already be rectified in hardware? And David goes on to talk about stuff like undocumented register flips, etc. To which CTS Labs responded with, I know exactly what you're talking about, that these chips could have undocumented features, and if you flip a bit in a register, this is known as a chicken bit, to enable some hidden feature or something that the engineers left behind on the design, that can help you to turn certain parts of the chip on or off. And what he says here is, maybe they can do that after all, we just don't know because it's not very well documented. Finishing off by, they're doing their own estimates, it may be incorrect, we don't really know or understand, and then the conversation just kind of trailed off and he didn't finish the sentence. Now this kind of goes against what CTS Labs said in their white paper, about no known mitigations and all the scaremongering language that was used. But what we're seeing here now, after being pressed by a guy, David Cantor, who knows about these things, we see some kind of admission that perhaps there are ways to mitigate this in hardware. This next one was pretty interesting. Ian Curtis again asking, would there be any circumstance in which you would be willing to share the details of these vulnerabilities and exploits under NDA with them? To which the response was, they would love to, but there is one quirk. According to Israeli export laws, they cannot share the vulnerabilities with people outside of Israel, unless they are a company that provides mitigations to such vulnerabilities. And just to note, after the call ended, in the commentary and clarification part of the article, Anantech reached out to their legal contacts that are familiar with this situation, which led to the line, it's bullshit, there are no restrictions. Ian then went on to ask, did you pre-brief the press before you spoke to AMD? Noting that when the information went live, some press were ready to go with the relevant stories and must have had the information in advance. To which they respond with, they would have to check the timing on that and get back to them. They don't know off the top of their heads, which does not seem very reasonable and likely to me. And right at the very end, the screw is being turned, with David Cantor finally asking the question that has been on my mind from the very start. I think the biggest question that I still have is that ultimately, who originated this request for analysis? Who was the customer that kicked this all off? The response being, I definitely am not going to comment on our customers. But Cantor's been around for a very long time in this industry, and he pressed on with, what about the flavour of customer? Is it a semiconductor company? Is it someone in the industry? Or is it someone outside the industry? I don't expect you to disclose the name, but the genre seems quite reasonable. At which point CTS Labs abruptly ended the call saying, guys, I'm sorry, we're really going to need to jump off this call, but feel free to follow up with any more questions. So I'm going to end this extremely long and involved and difficult video with an analysis of everything that I can see and what has transpired here. And the obvious place to start is with CTS Labs themselves. And we'll start off with the white paper itself. At the top of page 2, CTS Labs note with concern that AMD's outsourced partner, ASMedia, who are a subsidiary of Asus Tech Computer, a company that has recently been penalised by the FTC for neglecting security vulnerabilities and put under mandatory external security audits for the next 20 years. Now this is all true enough. However, over at golem.de we find that this is for the router business of the parent company Asus and the firmware for those devices, and not the production of chips or processors for ASMedia. Why would they write this? They either didn't know about it, or they are out to create fear, uncertainty and doubt. And this was just on page 2. Now again, I talked about all this stuff where again the FUD came thick and fast. AMD, we're on your plane, putting lives at risk. And throughout all of this, they maintained the same story that the reason they've gone public with this was basically down to an altruistic motive. It's all about consumer protection. And in their CTO's response, they said, I honestly think it's hard to believe they're the only group in the world who has those vulnerabilities, considering who the actors in the world are today, and with CTS Labs only being a small group of 6 researchers. You remember Dan Guido of Trail of Bits? The company who were paid $14,000-$15,000 to verify these AMD flaws, again on March the 15th, so 2 days after the reveal, said there is no immediate risk of exploitation of these vulnerabilities for most users. Even if the full details were published today, attackers would need to invest significant development efforts to build attack tools that utilise these vulnerabilities, and that this level of effort is beyond the reach of most attackers. And Dan finishes with, these types of vulnerabilities should not surprise any security researcher researchers. Similar flaws have been found in other embedded systems that have attempted to implement security features. They're the result of simple programming flaws, unclear security boundaries, and insufficient security testing, which was in contrast to Meltdown Inspector flaws, which used previously unknown techniques and novel research advances to discover and exploit. Meltdown Inspector are a different type of exploit as well, in that they would be level 1 exploits. A determined attacker can gain control of the machine basically from anywhere due to Meltdown Inspector. All this rise and fall master key stuff, these are level 2 exploits, requiring the ability to run an executable as an admin on the machine. The argument being here is that, well, if somebody who wants to exploit your machine already has admin privileges, you're already screwed anyway. And one argument I often saw regarding this was that if a person already had that administrator access, they could do anything they wanted to your machine an awful lot easier than this. But this would point to this small group of 6 researchers very likely being the only group in the world who has those vulnerabilities today. So who was it that invested significant development efforts to build attack tools that utilise those vulnerabilities, if that level of research is beyond the reach of most attackers? Yesterday, CTS Labs showed their proof of concept attack Master Key 1 on an Epic machine with a Taiwan motherboard, I believe, and it does work, so they have the resources to do this. So with all of this in mind, I have to ask, what is CTS Labs getting out of this? Somebody somewhere must have paid them a lot of money for this. And of course, the obvious answer to that would be Viceroy Research, who of course wrote that rather premature obituary on AMD. But this was recently denied. Had it been Viceroy Research, then it has been a complete failure because AMD's stock price has barely budged. And they should have known that this would have been the case. Look at what happened after Spectre and Meltdown. Not a great deal, in fact, to either Intel or AMD's stock price. This report was also released 1 year after Ryzen launched, while AMD were holding another event. The chances of some good news and leaks coming out of that event are pretty high, which were more likely to push the stock price higher. If this was an attempt at stock manipulation, they picked the worst possible time, and they have picked a method already proven to be unreliable in terms of reducing stock prices. So by now I'm left thinking, who has the most to gain out of all of this? And when you consider AMD's competitors, you're basically down to 2 companies, Nvidia and Intel. As we've learned this week and last, Nvidia are capable of finding easier ways, and ways that have clear benefits for their company. Nvidia has no benefit out of this whatsoever. They're not in a CPU war with AMD, so that really only leaves us with Intel. And the deeper I looked into this, the more realistic that Intel's involvement here became. Obviously, we know all about Intel's involvement in Israel. They have a massive manufacturing plant there, and they give out grants and loans to startups and universities. They have a huge presence in Israel. Of course, alone that doesn't mean anything, but at least it's a point to start with. But looking at this white paper, and then the CTO's letter, and then the fact that they only gave AMD 24 hours prior notice, and then looking over AnandTech and all the calls and all the articles written on CTS Labs over the previous week, one major component in all of this has been very conspicuous by its absence, and that is Intel. Not once in all of this, the white paper, the letters, or the articles, has CTS Labs ever referred to Intel. Not one time. This chimera vulnerability they discovered in the ASMedia chipset also affects Intel, yet not once were Intel mentioned in the white paper. It was all about Ryzen Pro. It was only when pushed by AnandTech that they admitted that the chimera vulnerability exists also on other PCs. They didn't mention Intel though, they just said other PCs. And let's go back to AMDflaws.com and their full disclaimer. And right at the very bottom, CTS reserves the right to change the contents of this website and the restrictions on its use, with or without notice, but also CTS reserves the right to refrain from updating this website even as it becomes outdated or inaccurate. What kind of disclaimer is that? Well, if you look right at the very bottom of AMDflaws.com, we can see this section, Existing Solutions. And surprise, surprise, there are no existing solutions. And if you imagine that AMD did discover solutions, which I will get to later, then CTS Labs, by their own disclaimer, would not have to update this part of the website. In other words, this entire website, based around these supposed AMD flaws, could now just sit here forever with no existing solution to the flaws. Somebody might hear about this in a couple of years. Somebody who has influence when it comes to buying, say, a bunch of servers, maybe wasn't following it all that closely at the time, but then heard about this AMD flaws with their new Epic CPUs, comes to this website, sees a list of the flaws, and sees that there are no solutions to these flaws. This kind of thing would be written in a contract. Perhaps a contract written with one of AMD's competitors. Again, over at Trail of Bits, this level of effort is beyond the reach of most attackers. How many companies out there can truly afford to invest their significant development efforts to build these kind of attacks, utilising these vulnerabilities? Could it be CTS Labs? They certainly look like they've got plenty of money. They were able to pay for professional video. They were able to throw 15 grand at Trail of Bits in order to validate their claims. And in their CTO's letter and update, they said that, in retrospect, they would have done this with 5 third-party validators to remove any doubts. A lesson for next time: 5 times $15,000, 75 grand to validate these claims. So that's 75 grand there. We have the 2 videos, these 2 professionally done videos. There's another 10 grand plus easily. Overall, you're talking maybe $100,000 for this whole thing. And make no mistake about it, we are talking free cash here. There are plenty of companies out there with $100,000, but for them to just go and talk about throwing around that kind of money means they must have an awful lot more than that. What you're looking at now is an image of CTS Labs offices. No, it's not this one. It's not this one either. It's this little one in here. This kind of beaten up rectangular block is the offices of CTS Labs. Now, I don't know exactly, but I reckon for a unit like this, depending on location, I highly doubt the rent on it would cost more than 20 grand a year, possibly a lot less. If any of you know for sure, then please let me know. But the point here is, this little beaten up unit here, which has to accommodate 6 workers of CTS Labs, does this look like the kind of office to you from a bunch of guys that can just drop $100,000 in order to validate their claims? A claim that, from the outset, they have made out to be in the consumer interest and an altruistic motive. How much were they paid and by whom? And last night, AMD released their initial technical assessment of CTS Labs research. They've came out and said, yep, they're right, these are vulnerabilities, however, they have a bunch of mitigations planned already. What is interesting here is that there are no performance impacts expected. That's Master Key, that's Rise and Fall and Fallout, and that's also for Chimera. This should not be surprising, as most of these vulnerabilities are not performance related. These fixes are more about fixing it at the BIOS level and before the operating system is loaded. But this here leads me to ask the final question. You've got this new startup, CTS Labs, who we know have been around doing various dubious things for a few years. Surely this company, instead of writing this ridiculous white paper in an attempt to do what? Perhaps gain some money from shorting AMD stock? Something they already saw had pretty much failed with Meltdown Inspector. Far larger, far more serious vulnerabilities. Why would they not just have gone to AMD instead? They could have got paid by AMD to do more research into this. It would have been ongoing money over the coming 6 months. At which point, had they followed known security protocols, they could then have gone ahead and released the research. AMD would have paid this company handsomely to keep this quiet for the next 6 months. For me, there can only be one reason why they didn't do that, and that reason is they were paid even more handsomely to get these AMD flaws out in the open as fast as they could over as many publications as they possibly could. At the end of 2017, I said that 2018 would be the hardest, dirtiest fought year in tech history. There's a strong suspicion that Nvidia are definitely up to no good, and I now have a strong suspicion that Intel are similarly up to no good. That is simply my suspicion. There is no way to know for sure unless these things go to court. I know people say Jim's having a go at Intel again, no surprise there, or he's got the tinfoil hat on again. But for me, when you look deeper here, who here has gained the most? And even though Intel suffers from Chimera as well, when it comes to security, Intel's name is already mud anyway. Meltdown, Spectre, you had their management engine stuff a few months previous to that. Intel and security is a joke, and Chimera just makes it even more of a joke. However, this whole thing, this whole hit piece on AMD helps to bring AMD down to Intel's level. Short-term stock manipulation? That would just have been a bonus. But right, I'm done with this one. This has been exhausting, putting all of this together and telling the story, and I have no doubt it is an exceptionally long video. But with a bit of luck, I may be back before the weekend with a tech talk video and an update on 1 or 2 of these more recent videos I have made previously. But if you haven't already, don't forget to like and subscribe. Check out all the links in the video description below, including my Amazon links and all that stuff. And I'll catch you later, guys.